Today, we're diving into a pretty provocative theory, one that looks at the major global conflicts we see everywhere and asks, what if they aren't accidents? What if they're actually part of a plan?
I mean, it's a question a lot of us have, right? You see the headlines day after day, the staggering costs in lives and money, and you just wonder, why do these wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, why do they just keep grinding on and on? Is there some kind of logic to it all that we're just not seeing?
Well, the source we're explaining today argues that, yeah, there is a logic. It says this is no accident. The theory is that these aren't just isolated events, but are actually the predictable results of a deliberate, decades-long plan. So let's dig into it.
Okay, so the core idea here is that U.S. foreign policy isn't just reacting to things year by year. Instead, the argument is that it's following a consistent grand strategy, one that's been in place for decades, and it really doesn't matter which political party is in the White House. Now, to really get this argument, we have to talk about a key term, the deep state. The source isn't talking about some shadowy conspiracy here. It's pointing to a very real network of institutions, the CIA, the Pentagon, the big defense contractors. And it argues that this network is what maintains a single, consistent foreign policy agenda over the long haul.
So what is that big goal? According to the source, it's a concept called primacy. You might also hear it called hegemony or full-spectrum dominance. The bottom line is, it's the idea that the U.S. must remain the world's one and only undisputed superpower. So from this perspective, the problem with countries like Russia or China isn't really about their specific actions. It's just the fact that they're big, powerful countries that could challenge that number one spot. Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this grand strategy actually play out in the real world? Well, the source points to Russia first, arguing that what we're seeing is the result of a consistent 30-year project.
The source lays out a pretty deliberate timeline. It all starts in 1990, with a U.S. promise that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. But just a few years later, in 1994, that policy does a complete 180. The Clinton administration is suddenly backing NATO expansion. Then, in 97, a key strategist actually outlines a plan to encircle Russia. And then the big one, in 2008, NATO formally invites Ukraine and Georgia to join. So if you look at it this way, the current conflict wasn't a surprise at all, but the end result of a proactive 30-year project. And to make this point, the source draws a parallel to the 19th century British Empire and its rivalry with Russia. The argument is that, just like the British back then, the U.S. has encouraged what the source calls a fabricated hatred, a Russophobia, all to justify this long-term geopolitical game. It's like they're repeating a script from the past. And all of this brings us right to the doorstep of Ukraine, which this theory presents not as some sudden crisis, but as the planned endgame of this 30-year strategy. And here you can really see the two narratives clash. The common story is that this was an unprovoked invasion by Russia in 2022, a war for Ukraine's sovereignty. But this theory reframes it completely. It says this was the predictable result of that 30-year push by the U.S. to expand NATO, that it's really a proxy war, with Ukraine being used to weaken Russia. And get this, it argues the war didn't start in 2022 at all, but way back in 2014 with what it calls a U.S.-backed coup. To illustrate the point, the source gives this really stark analogy. It's like a boxing match. The U.S. and its allies are the coach, and their fighter, Ukraine, is getting absolutely bloodied. But instead of stopping the fight, the coach just keeps yelling, "Go on out there and hit him again." The argument is that this strategy is a disaster for Ukraine, destroying the country in the name of a bigger strategic goal.
Okay, so the source makes that case for Russia and Ukraine. But then it argues that this exact same blueprint, this long-term plan for reshaping a whole region, has also been used in the Middle East.
The starting point for this, according to the source, is a 1996 policy paper called the Clean Break Strategy. It was written for the incoming Israeli prime minister, and it laid out a totally new vision. Basically, forget making peace. The new goal should be to reshape the entire region by getting rid of governments that were hostile to Israeli and U.S. interests.
And according to the source, this wasn't just a theory on paper. It points to people like General Wesley Clark, a former NATO commander, who said that right after 9/11, the Pentagon had a literal list of 7 countries to overthrow in 5 years. And that list was Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finally, Iran. The source claims this list has basically been the roadmap for the region's conflicts ever since.
So after laying out these two massive, multi-decade projects in both Europe and the Middle East, the source gets to a pretty stark and provocative conclusion about how it all turned out. So what's the verdict? The source argues this grand strategy has been a total failure. It says that far from cementing U.S. dominance, it's actually backfired spectacularly. It's cost trillions, it's destabilized whole regions, and, ironically, it's pushed rivals like Russia and China into a closer alliance against the U.S., ultimately making the world a much, much more dangerous place.
And that leaves us with one last lingering question to think about. If these massive projects have failed to make the world safer or more stable, and they've come at such an unbelievable cost, who exactly do they serve? Who truly benefits when a nation is in a state of perpetual war? It's definitely a question worth thinking about.